Professor Jens Martin Gurr is more than simply a professor, but most of all a professor at Essen, Duisburg. He's involved in Anglophone literature, which is a very special category that Americans don't always know about. That it's the study of English-speaking literature, but from a different perspective, I would say. And his interests have expanded very wide to the point where he accidentally bumped into me and some of my work many years ago, because he's very interested in urban issues and in a certain sense, media issues from a perspective of literature and the crossovers between literature and even 18th century philosophy and culture, which is another weird connection we both have, because I'm obsessed with the picaresque, which is very much an 18th century form. And then Professor Gurr is completing a book now dealing with the 18th century, but there's a wide range of things that he's been involved in. And he could briefly, I guess, tell you how we intersected. And then I hope that other pieces of his biography will filter in as we go. And we'll let Professor Jens Martin Gurr, introduce us to this odd, to me, not odd, but this unusual piece, Bleeding Through, right? So shall we start?
I'll be happy to. Thanks, Norman, for this kind of introduction, and thanks for showing up. This is the culmination maybe of something that goes back 15 years. So I remember that when Bleeding Through came out in 2003, I read it, I got it, played with the DVD, liked it, and started writing about it. And so as things go in the academic world, the essay took some 6 or 7 years to come out, and it came out in 2009. And we had a conference that we invited Norman to, and we had conversations then on the phone, no Zoom then. We chatted and invited Norman over for a conference, which we both don't quite remember how it came about, but it somehow didn't work. That you couldn't come, and so we were in touch. We were hoping to do something, and then 10 years later in 2019, this was 6 months before the pandemic. Norman wrote me an email saying, "I'm in Karlsruhe. Can we meet? I read one of your essays." And so I jumped on the train, went to Karlsruhe. We had a great day drinking coffee in Karlsruhe, talking about all sorts of things and discovering a number of shared obsessions. And one of those is the 18th century Picaret's novel. One is memory, media in the city. And so we decided that we would do something together. I mean, we invited Norman for a conference on media memory in the city to Essen in November 2019, which was literally 6 weeks or 8 weeks before everything shut down with COVID. And we agreed that we would do a new version of the book together, which we then called as a working title, Bleeding Through 20 Years Later. And what you see on the right is exactly that. The book came out last year. And part of what I want to do today is talk a little bit about media memory in the city and my take on Bleeding Through, which I'm hoping Norman will agree with. A lot of the things that we wrote about Bleeding Through, I think we're in agreement. There are some things that we see differently, but that's part of the fun. There's so much to be said, but what I mainly want to focus on is the representation of media memory in the city. So I want to talk a bit about what is Norman Klein on about in The History of Forgetting, which in a sense, in the research that he did in The History of Forgetting 1997 and the second volume in second edition in 2008. A lot of the research goes into Bleeding Through, and I think needs to be briefly introduced before we can come to Bleeding Through. And then I want to talk about what it feels like to navigate Bleeding Through, to navigate that original DVD, which I understand you have as a film version in the exhibition, but it was originally a DVD that people clicked through and explored, and nothing happened for more than 5 or 10 seconds unless you did something. So the experience of navigating Bleeding Through was central, at least to the 2003 DVD, and this is very different. We're trying to get a sense of that if you watch the film of me navigating bleeding through. You need to click, you need to do something all the time. And that, to me, in 2003, seemed very central. And we both have a sense that it would be less central now that everything is sort of digital and non-linear. A lot of what then seemed radical now may seem even more radical if you don't present it as a DVD, but in a film version. But I do want to talk about the idea of experiencing, navigating bleeding through, and then zoom in on media memory and the city. Walter Benjamin as a key theorist of layers of the city. And in many ways, the reading I would want to present is that what bleeding through does for Los Angeles is what Benjamin did for Paris in the Arcades project, and that what Norman Klein does for Los Angeles is in many ways similar to the work that Walter Benjamin did for Paris in the 19th century. So this is the book, the 2008 History of Forgetting Los Angeles and the Issue of Memory, which is essentially a very unusual scholarly book in that it has scholarly sections, but it also has what Norman Klein calls docu-fables, so brief literary essays, stories, fictions that document events in 20th century LA, and that especially deal with the central concern, what Norman Klein then calls the uneven decay of an Anglo identity in Los Angeles, and how the instability of hegemonic culture leads to bizarre overreactions in planning, policing, and how these are mystified in mass culture, which still seems to me to be a fair gist of what he does in History of Forgetting. And so a lot of what he does in History of Forgetting then informs bleeding through. So, for instance, the way in which ethnically connoted districts disappeared and were erased, Chinatown, Old Mexican Sonora, the Old Victorian slum district, how they were leveled virtually without a trace and turned into parts of downtown and parts of empty lots around downtown. And so the way he argues in History of Forgetting is that a lot of the neighborhoods that were razed were either ethnic neighborhoods or were at least perceived as being ethnically connoted neighborhoods. And a lot of that plays out indirectly in bleeding through. One of the things that interested me about the History of Forgetting is how sort of mockingly digital is in some places. So if Norman is saying that he's trying with as much modesty as possible to identify a form of literature that is not simply hybridized or denarratized and certainly not deconstructed, the idea is that by structure, he means how to generate alternatives within the text itself. So this idea that the text gives you a choice. You may know this from children's books. If you want Joe to go through the left door, read on page 50. If you want him to go through the right door, read on page 100. That sort of thing, that you have a choice of how you read the book, which isn't obviously the standard in scholarly books, but it's something that Norman explored in History of Forgetting and then took to a much more radical level in bleeding through. So take a passage like this. The only solution to this is a kind of hypertext. Click onto page 301. For the reader also interested in memory theory, I've included an appendix. Read it now or read it later wherever it suits you. So the idea of offering readers alternative ways of navigating a printed book, which you are traditionally supposed to read from cover to cover. And this idea of printing a book as a hypertext, offering a book as a hypertext, turned into a far more radical game with memory, media, and the city in bleeding through. But I think the research that Norman did for History of Forgetting needs to be there as a kind of background and context for the experience of navigating bleeding through, which in terms of content, in terms of what it says about Los Angeles historically, covers much the same ground, but does so in radically different ways. So the experience of navigating bleeding through, this is the cover of the original box, which is a 37-page novella, essentially about Molly's life in Los Angeles from 1920 to 1986, and a multimedia DVD with thousands of film clips, newspaper clippings, mind maps, photographs that you can navigate. And the essential thing, it seemed to me then, was that you didn't navigate this as you would a film, sort of, start it, watch it for 45 or 90 minutes, and then it ends, but that you needed to constantly do something. And as I said, I'm hoping that if you've had a look at the film version, some of that will come through from the way you see the hand clicking all the time and needing to do something all the time. I think we may be, and Norman might want to comment on that later, we may not be in full agreement about how important the clicking and clacking, as Norman sometimes calls it, is to the experience. It seemed more central to me than it might seem to Norman, that the non-linearity of it. But this is something we might want to discuss. So let me first say a few words about the novella. The 37-page novella essentially covers the story of Molly in Los Angeles through some 60 years. And to some extent, the narrative hook is the question whether she killed her husband in 1959 or had him killed. And one of the ways in which the reader is pulled into the DVD is that you're trying to find out, that you're sort of a detective going through the material in search of the quest and discover all sorts of things about 20th century Los Angeles in the process. And so we have these seven moments of this old lady going into dementia, but she has these very clear moments, and these 7 clear moments are key moments in the text. So the narrator says, I couldn't trust any of her stories, not that her facts were wrong or that she didn't make an effort, but she'd fog out dozens of key facts. Whenever I notice, she'd blow me off smiling and say, so I'll lose a few years, but there were 7 memories in the years from 1920 to 1986 that were luminously detailed. And these 7 moments are sort of, essence, quintessential bits from what could have been a novel, and they make up some of what Bleeding Through does in the novella. And this is accompanied by the DVD that works in 3 levels or 3 tiers. And as Norman says in the print text of Bleeding Through, each tier of the DVD comments on a specific medium that tries to make the city intelligible as it erases. So whether it's photographs, newspaper clippings, or film clips, those seem to me to be the 3 quintessential forms. And this, you're forgetting, is a distraction from the basic reality of urban life in Los Angeles. And so these 3 levels would be, the first part is the Phantom of a Novel, 7 moments. So you have 3 moments, 3 phases in Molly's life that are illustrated with a lot of material. The second is the writer's backstory, which the narrator of the novella calls a contextualization. This is mostly newspaper clippings over decades, and they establish a context of other people and places more loosely connected. So you have newspaper clippings about key events and key dates in Los Angeles history in the 20th century, the erasure of Bunker Hill, the Black Dahlia, a number of crime cases. So basically newspaper clippings to give you a sense of the backdrop. And then section 3 is what is called excavation, digging behind the story in its locale. And this is a vast ironic index of what Molly left out and couldn't see, samples from the backstory. So the idea is the writer sits down at a desk and collects tons of material, and much of that doesn't find its way into the book. And here you get the material that gets lost when the movie or novel is made legible in the selection process. And what is usually lost is what you get in this 3rd level of the DVD, and that's mostly film and video sequences. So partly, sequences from documentaries, partly reshot sequences of iconic films that, for film rights reason, Norman, correct me if I'm wrong, were reshot with the same kind of camera angle but without the actors. And it's sort of an insider game for people. Do you recognize the scene? Is it from Heat? Is it Casino? Different scenes shot in LA that are reshot in the same location, sometimes years, sometimes decades later, playing a sort of an insider game of, do you get it?
Yes.
Do you recognize the scenes?
Oh, yes. It was this obsessive young film graduate student who lived and breathed these films. And so he put the camera exactly where it was on the films. And then in this worshipful way, he explained what it is that was going on, assuming that the viewer was so magically involved the way he was, that the viewer would see the film in the mind's eye. I remember Kotke, the designer, kept saying, Norman, you should talk. Let your bullshit come in. You know, I said, no, I think his bullshit's better because it's so sincere. The sincerity of it is just amazing. I mean, this guy spent months literally taking every camera angle of Heat, of DOA, and other films, and then saying, we're standing here with Robert De Niro. It seemed to me it was about the irony of what makes us believe a film and that a film is really a location. So I call it a social imaginary and so on. So that would be my answer.
What seems important to me here is that, and this will be central to what I'll be saying later about media memory in the city, is that what a viewer or a reader knows plays a role even if it isn't physically there. So that this may be a reshot sequence, and the buildings from the original film may no longer be there. But what a reader knows, what a viewer knows, quintessentially matters to place identity, even if it leaves no physical trace. And that's something I'll come back to. So what Norman talked about in History of Forgetting, the erasure of entire neighborhoods, is also central to both the text of Bleeding Through and to the DVD. So hundreds of buildings gone that could just as easily have been caused by carpet bombing or a volcano erupting in the central business district. So whole areas, whole plots erased, often left vacant for a long time, redeveloped in odd ways. And all of these sort of redevelopment projects play a role in Bleeding Through. So take the erasure of Bunker Hill and the building of what is now downtown Los Angeles. What you then find is if you go through the original, and you may have seen the film clip, is that you constantly toggle this bar of photographs. You click in, you can have Norman as a narrator clicked on, have him tell the background story of Molly, have him comment on the backdrop of Molly's story, have him give these moments from her life. And at the same time, you can look at these hundreds and in the other sections, thousands of photographs, enlarge them, go back, have film clips. And one of the iconic features of Bleeding Through is these bleeds, is these overlaid going back and forth between some of the old photographs from the 1920s all the way to the 1980s that sort of morph one into the other or bleed one into the other. I have one here that I'd like to show you for a second.
Oh yeah, are you there still?
Should work.
Okay, good. I'm just waiting for Murphy's Law to intrude. That's all. I remember they were so exhausted. They would come in on Monday. Couldn't understand why they were exhausted. It's very hard to match these.
Yeah, and this is one of the iconic ones that we also later used for the cover of the reedition.
And the old drugstore. That's the murder scene connected with the James Elroy novel, right? Yes.
So I just meant to give you a brief glimpse of just to get a sense of how you can have it with Norman as a narrator, without Norman as a narrator, going back and forth, and even if you click on an image and go 3 to the right and go back 3 to the left, you won't even end up with the same image because it's brought up from a random database. That seemed central to me at the time, but Norman might want to comment later that it wasn't. It was less central to what he was trying to do than it was to some perceptions. Norman, you might want to comment on that.
Oh, yeah, well, that's a whole little melodrama that we could get to later. It's interesting, right? And it's part of the history of the 20th century idea of the modern being the erasure also of narrative hooks, if you will, and narrative elements with the belief that that's not a narrative. But I always would say to people, is there a beginning? Yes. He said, is there an end? Yes. He said, so exactly what do you mean by narrative? You know, just because it does something else, right? I mean, music also begins and ends, right? And so forth. But it's interesting. Also, I have this terrible other thing. We can't get to it now, but that some of the problems in bleeding through have now affected the American elections. And it seems to me that we live in a world almost like these bleeds, you know. But that's for another day. But you and I will invent another way to keep going, right?
I was going to say there'd be so much to say about the politics of bleeding through, which
Yes.
ends with reference to the war in Iraq in 2003, and ends with some of the things that we then thought were madness. But you know.
Oh no, that's a whole other subject. Yeah, it came out at an inflection point in the history of Los Angeles, but also in the history of the West, and certainly in the history of the United States. But
And what
I have this expression I always use: fish don't know they're wet, but they have premonitions. Just look at a fish's face. You know, they look very nervous all the time, right? And I was having premonitions, but I didn't believe them, and I think they're echoed in the piece. And I think you read them, you noticed them. Anyway,
and then
I'm interested to hear the rest of your argument also. I don't want to.
And then one of the things Norman did for the volume that we published last year, 20 years after the original Bleeding Through, was an essay that takes us from 1986, when Molly's story ends, to 2021, and a lot of the things that happened in LA since, and a number of the key moments in urban development in the last 35 years or so. Taking the story further from 1986, taking it further even than 2003 when the first version appeared, to 2021 when we stopped working and we're basically done with the second version of the book. What I want to zoom in now is what I've found most interesting, and what has, you know, kept us talking since 2019 when we first discussed this, is the question of Walter Benjamin and the representation of layers, which seem to me to be very central to the way Bleeding Through works. So the question, of course, is how do you represent a city that is so quintessentially relies on being rebuilt in places, and that has one of the ironies is, if you take the iconic scene of City Hall with an old photograph, for a pre-war photograph, and then the bleed into the 1980s.
That's so good. That's so good. That was so smart of them to do this.
I thought that was excellent. And of course, one of the things is that this iconic match dissolve overlays are a 1943 image of South Main Street with City Hall in the background, with a modern image of the glass and steel block of the old Caltrans annex building. And even that is, of course, no longer there, as you know better than I do.
Yes, or Tom Main, right?
That's opposite. The Tom Main building is right opposite that. And so one of the things that you know, I'll show you images of what is there now. That's the new LAPD headquarters is in that spot now, if I'm not entirely mistaken.
No, you're not.
And the Caltrans is right opposite, right? The new Caltrans
Yes.
District 6 is right opposite the Tom Main
Yeah.
Morphosis building. I have images of that in a moment. So one of the things that struck me is that people keep talking about the city as a palimpsest, which I don't find the best term. I think Walter Benjamin's concept, and this is something Norman and I have discussed over and over again, if you take the idea of the palimpsest as a manuscript that has the old writing erased and then written over, as in this possibly most famous, the Archimedes palimpsest, that seems to me to be a less than ideal representation of, or a conceptualization of how urban layers happen. Because one of the things that is quintessential to the palimpsest is that the layers have nothing to do with each other. They just happen to be written one over the other, but it's become so common in urban studies and in ways of talking about the city to talk about the city as a palimpsest. And it seems to us that the other conceptualization, namely that through Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, works even better, and it is even more illuminating, because with a palimpsest, you only really speak of a palimpsest if the old layer is still somehow physically there, as you see here. But in a lot of cases, and LA is obviously a good example of that, you might have a building from the early 2000s and not a single trace is left of the 1970s building, and even less of a trace is left of the 1930s building that stood there. So the palimpsest suggests that these layers are physically there, whereas superposition, which is Benjamin's term, which I'll introduce in a moment, suggests that what an observer knows was there, even if it left no trace, can be equally important to something that is still there. So this is based on Benjamin's Passagenwerk, which is about 1,000 pages on the Paris arcades of the 19th century, with 3,500 quotations from 800 sources in 36 folders. And it's some kind of hypertext because you have cross references in 32 symbols, a pink star and a triangle and an arrow and an asterisk, sort of marking thematic clusters across the different folders. And some people have spoken this as a kind of hypertext before hypertext existed because it's linked across these different folders. And Benjamin himself said that this work must develop to perfection the art of citing without quotation marks. Its theory is closely tied to the technique of montage, and quintessentially the Passagenwerk is basically a modernist poem, Marjorie Perloff has called it, of these 3,500 quotations piled up, that together, in Bolle's terminology, this constellation of building blocks of text, which are used in an attempt to translate the order of the city into the syntax of a historiographic text. And one of the crucial things why I'm giving you the German translation, the Arcades project, is, there's a wonderful Belknap Press, Harvard University Press translation of the Passagenwerk, but the title doesn't quite do what the German title does, because Passagen in German is the arcades, but Passagen is also passages of text. And so it's the simulation of the 19th century arcades in passages of text. And the ambiguity of Passagen in German has both the arcades and the passages of text. And this somehow gets lost in the English arcades, where arcades are just the arcades, but not the passages of text, which is why I'm insisting that the German sort of needs to be brought in, because that ambiguity is central to what Benjamin is doing, but simply cannot be translated. But anyway, so what Walter Benjamin, I think, informs Bleeding Through, because in the History of Forgetting, the work that so centrally provides the research that then went into Bleeding Through, includes a 6-page speculative piece, Noir as the Ruins of the Left. And that has the fiction that Benjamin, who, as I'm sure you know, committed suicide when he tried to escape German-occupied, Nazi-occupied France in 1940 and was stopped at the border and took his own life. In Norman's speculative piece, then I quote, Benjamin does not commit suicide. He takes a boat to New York and winds up among the German émigrés. Being too much of a scholar of the city streets, he chooses not to live in the Pacific Palisades, not to bow at the feet of Thomas Mann, who was the sort of the cultural master of that area. But Benjamin moves instead to Boyle Heights, and he writes 50 pages of notes for a Los Angeles Passagenwerk. Nothing as elaborate as what Benjamin planned to write on the Parisian arcades. And my reading would then be that Bleeding Through is the kind of work that Benjamin would have produced on Los Angeles with the technological means of the early 21st century. In other words, this is in many ways the Arcades project for Los Angeles. And so the crucial idea that Benjamin introduces here is superposition, which is a sort of an overlay, both in terms of time and in terms of space. And he has this wonderful phrase that if a shoemaker shop is the neighbor to a confectioner's, then the festoons of bootlaces will resemble rolls of licorice, because you sort of take the impression that you have of the confectioners to the shoe shop next door, and these images are sort of overlaid and morph one into the other. And Benjamin then argues that this perception of space, superposition, is this interpenetrating and superposed transparency of the world of the flaneur. So the argument is that the flaneur who walks through the city somehow has the ability to see all of the different levels of time, anything that ever happened in that space. And this is, he says, the flaneur's basic experience. And thanks to this phenomenon of superposition, this overlay, everything that has potentially taken place in this space is perceived simultaneously. And I think this is a marvelous formulation. Space winks at the flaneur. What do you think may have happened here? So the idea that the flaneur is someone who is able to see all these different layers. And so superposition is both the layering of these different levels of time and the ability to perceive it. And so the question I'm asking is superposition a kind of an involuntary form of perception, as Benjamin describes it, or can superposition not also be a technique that is consciously applied in urban studies? And in many ways, what Bleeding Through on the DVD does is it uses the technique of superposition to morph these or overlay these different images. And so in a sense, to simulate the perception of a flaneur in Benjamin's sense, someone who walks through the city and has all this knowledge of what used to be there and what was there and brings that in. And Benjamin has this wonderful formulation of how that feels to the flaneur in Paris when he speaks of this as an anamnestic intoxication, an anamnestic in the sense of anamnesis, like the doctor's prehistory of a disease. And this is the intoxication in which the flaneur goes about the city, not only feeds on sensory data, not only things he sees and hears and smells before him, but taking shape before his eyes, but often also with abstract knowledge, indeed, of dead facts as something experienced and lived through. And this knowledge travels from one person to the other. And the argument is, and this is the last 4 lines, wouldn't he then, the flaneur, have necessarily felt the steep slope behind the church of Notre Dame de Lorette, which is, church in Paris? Wouldn't he feel the slope behind the church rise all the more insistently under the soles of his feet if he realized that here at one time, after Paris has gotten its first omnibuses, which were initially horse-drawn coaches, the cheval de renfort, the reinforcement horse, the additional horse that's needed to pull the carriage up the steep street. If you know as a flaneur that this is the place where the street became so steep, they had to add an extra horse, you would feel how steep the street is much more than if you didn't know it, although it's physically the same street. So this is Benjamin's notion that what you know about a place quintessentially informs your perception of that place, and you're able as a flaneur even to see things that happened there long before anything, even when anything that's there physically now has erased all traces of what was there before. And so what I found so interesting in researching the sites of Bleeding Through, the past of a site doesn't necessarily have to be physically seen to be remembered and to inform perception. And so if you take this old 1930s photograph with City Hall in the backdrop, and then have the old Caltrans building that stood in its place later, 3 years after this second photograph was taken in 2002, the old Caltrans Annex building was torn down to make room for the new headquarters of LA Police Department that was then completed in 2009. So this overlay that formed the cover of the original Bleeding Through, even that modern building was erased in 2004 or 2005. And what you have there now is this building. And we couldn't resist the idea of using that overlay and to add a third layer and to have a designer sort of do this pretty rough cut overlay of all 3 layers. That's what we used as a cover to the new edition. Just to get a sense of how central the idea of what you know about a place, even a building that was there for 30 or 40 years, even that is now erased. And what you have opposite is the Caltrans building that Norman mentions, the Morphodis building, 100 South Main Street, that was completed in 2004. That's pretty much opposite that site. And so part of what we're arguing, I think, is that it's central to the perception of a city, not just what is physically there, but what you know. And in contrast to the idea of the palimpsest, the argument we're making is that if you bring Benjamin to LA and bring the ideas that Benjamin developed in the Arcades project for the representation of Paris in the 19th century, if you bring that to LA and if you use the notion of superposition as this sort of physical and mental layering in the mind of an observer, that is so central to understanding this multiple erasure and rebuilding and the presence of the past to LA that we couldn't resist using that for the cover of the new book. And I'm happy to discuss and think with Norman and discuss and answer questions if you have any. So I'll stop the presentation and I'm happy to discuss. Thank you so much.
I have one more irony about Benjamin to add, by the way. the Lorette, that one location, that odd location around the Lorette church, also became the name of a kind of prostitute who would haunt upper bourgeois people. And there were illustrations of Lorettes playing with the expensive watch fob of their clients. But the irony is, by the time it reaches his memory, the Lorette term had disappeared. And yet, see, premonitions. I wonder so whether the term had some additional. So I was looking at the language. It's so strange. It's a wonderful talk, and you've now convinced me that I was smarter than I thought. Right? It's the irony that you eventually get completely convinced by someone who is bright enough to actually see other layers in your approach. And it is true. I've had this strange relationship to Benjamin. I guess I told you that Weibel wanted to fly me to a Benjamin committed suicide to perform as an American version of Walter Benjamin. And I said, sure, why not? You know, he's dead. You know, is there a dinner, restaurant, you know, anything? So, and then he was going to fly me around to Benjamin's locations. So there is this strange physicalized connection to Benjamin and his strange journey also, which fits our moment today, because we're going to become Walter Benjamins again. Whenever a government swings rapidly to the right, you have noir kind of elements and people like Walter Benjamin. So I think we can expect many Benjamins in the future. Anyway, it's just wonderful to hear all this, and now I don't have to talk about myself. I'm not very good at that. You're better at that than I am, I think. And the conversation won't stop. I think you made it very clear. Now, I hope that there are maybe a few questions, if that's possible. And do any people have any questions or comments? Oh, yes, maybe you could get to the microphone. Sorry. That's Margot.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm very interested. I read the book and understand your argument. I wonder too, though, if you might add another layer, just to suggest this, to the argument about the flaneur and the flanarial visual experience of the city, and certainly bleeding through accentuates that visual experience. But another metaphorical figure crucial to Benjamin is the figure of the rag picker, as a kind of alter ego to the poet flaneur, the practiced eye, the artist, the modern artist, is this allegorical or metaphorical figure of the rag picker, who is about the refuse, the detritus, the garbage, which so informs 20th century art practice, assemblage, found objects, recycling. The whole notion of recycling in Baudelaire's poem, the rag picker's wine, the jumbled vomit of Paris. And so in a way, I do think that there's another layer to the connection, because I look at Bleeding Through and I see snatches of lost time. I see that quality of, and you also mentioned the nostalgic quality of Bleeding Through, but you connect it simply to the vintage aspect, the vintage quality of the photographs, films, and so forth. But I think there's a philosophical quality as well, and I just wanted to suggest that as the figure of the rag picker, that who assembles and reassembles, and the detritus or the refuse of modernity.
Totally, absolutely, couldn't agree more. And you've phrased it so well. I can't really add to that. But yes, I totally agree. That is there as well.
Boy, yeah. I mean, so the person who just spoke to you, we live together, so you can imagine how many conversations about lost time we have, and how much time has been lost on lost time. But But the whole awareness of time and the legibility of time is also this gigantic crisis that's afflicting our media cultures today. So yeah, Benjamin really was very perceptive. I mean, he definitely was a fish who had premonitions of many things. Other questions, observations? It's sort of, there's actually a group of people here now. Suddenly, I didn't realize we now have people. Yeah. And there's Andrew. Is there anything you want to say? Only because we share the same room often and have endless chats, right? This is John Hawk, filmmaker.
Great to meet you. Yeah. You know, this brought up something that just occurred to me late in life. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. It's a very beautiful city and a lot of lakes. And it dawned on me that where I lived, to take this layering even further, just over maybe 150 years ago, was virgin forest, like completely natural, right? And I was so adjusted to how it looked as I grew up. You know, it's a nice house up on a hill and a view and everything. And then it was like a shuddering experience to realize that at one point this was a virgin forest of Douglas fir with in a total natural state in a very recently, you know, like 125 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Before any sort of urbanization, right, at all.
And the echo also, you live in a fairly rustic part of Southern California, and my house is filled possibly with those forests because Douglas fir was used to dress up a lot of the houses in Southern California. So I probably have leaned on those forests in my house.
Yeah.
A tree near my house is probably part of your
Yeah. Oh, the Douglas fir thing. You know, there's a place in Warner Brothers that's called the Clint Eastwood Room because Clint Eastwood wouldn't let it be torn down. And it was there that they would put sound to scoring various films. And I went in there and they were scoring some absolutely hideous bullshit piece of cinema that was almost an insult to the very fact of cinema. But there it was, and I was there. And then I said, what are these strange things missing? And so we ripped off some of the ceiling trim because it makes it sound more as if there's an orchestra in the theater. I said, holy shit, that's so strange. And then he said, what are these new? I said, oh, we went to the same Douglas fir forest to replace the wood so it would find the same echo. So I mean, yeah. So we could have an anti-tour of trees and go through people's houses. I mean, the layering thing, but that is very similar to what Benjamin was doing. He was looking through minutia, don't you think? Yes, I mean
I'm glad you raised the question of a very rapid transformation. I mean that there is this strange sense that the palimpsest and superposition are usually only ever applied to sort of old European cities. So you have this about Rome and Paris and St. Petersburg, etc. But it seems to me, and I've written about this with our own region, that the post-industrial rural region, where you have in the same site at a 12th century agricultural mansion, a 19th century coal mine, a 20th century car manufacturing plant, and a 21st century logistics plant. And they're all in the same building. They've all left bits and pieces. Or there's another wonderful example in my region that strikes me as very Benjaminian. This is in the highly industrial city of Herne, which was basically flatlands and agricultural space until the mid-19th century, and then turned into a coal mining area. And what you have there is a beautiful Art Nouveau-ish sort of 1908 street that's completely survived the war and has this 1908 Art Nouveau-ish street. And every single building has a little pedestal on the wall, and you're wondering, what the hell was that? Did it have a sculpture on it or what? And then if you look at the old photographs, this was actually a 1908 arcade that had a glass roof, and the only reason they tore that down in the 1920s is that, can I say it, pitch and shit and coal dust made it so dark no one could see anything. And so they took down the roof, but they left the little pillars on every single house that you can still see. And you literally, if you know that this, nobody could possibly see that this had a glass roof. But if you walk through this, you know the old photographs, you feel like a flaneur, and you suddenly see this pitch and shit coal dust coated glass roof, just because you have these little pillars that held the roof. So yes, this can be very rapid and can occur in very few years, even in cities that aren't as old as Rome or Paris.
And being the son of a kosher butcher, I can tell you the smells move pretty fast through the neighborhood and through my life. I mean, in fact, we're in a room now that would have been filled with, I guess, what animal? Clydesdale. They kept Clydesdale horses here, and they tilted the room slightly so they could hose down, I guess, the shit. The muck. And here we are sitting comfortably, right? No Clydesdales around. But then when you think about it, the echo of it is extraordinary. That's why I have those crazy anti-tours where I take people around and only show them what's missing until gradually they start to see what's missing. If you don't see what's missing, you really have almost no chance of getting much done about so many things in life. And the fact that you located this piece that I did that had traveled around, right, and brought me back to it is such a miracle in my life. I have to thank you. I won't get mushy about it, but thank you. Right.
Oh, thank you.
And we have this is Andrew here. Yes.
So maybe I can start by saying congratulations, Norman, for now being in your 50th year at CalArts.
That's actually 600 years in dog years.
It's a process, but really, I could ask just about the anti-tours. If I had to do my own anti-tour, you're just to give me a booklet or some suggestions, where at least the top 3 or even 5 places I'd have to go.
Well, I used to make it very simple that there's an arc. In fact, Bleeding Through follows the arc in a way because Broadway, where her shop would have been, is what was sort of damnation 12 times over for a long time. It was so wonderfully screwed up. You could actually go back and forth almost a century. And now the Chinese investors are taking it over, and you can enjoy a new kind of vegan breakfast there. So I can't, the problem is that that's not proper. I would say there's the area of what they call MacArthur Park seems to be a good place. In fact, the last time I did it was an MA student from London, you might remember, who was visiting, and she was driving along and kept getting lost. And wherever she got lost was the anti-tour. I thought it was interesting to have someone go to the wrong places, and she found so many good wrong places all around downtown. In fact, we're in one right now, obviously. This is a warehouse district that looks like something from the 30 Years' War, almost. You know, it's so strange. And you'd find it very, very odd. It seems almost beyond dehumanized, right? And I don't know when it was humanized and what it was like. And artists have reclaimed it, as they often do, right? Because it's cheaper, right? $1 a square foot, anything like it, then artists will show up. But so we're actually in a space that is a kind of anti-tour. It'd be interesting to walk through and see what this scrap metal area must be about 6 blocks around, right? What the hell was it and where did it go? So it would be very easy to do it.
Maybe a follow-up would be, is there anywhere in LA County that wouldn't be fertile ground for an anti-tour?
It's hard to find one. I mean, when I went to Essen, I had a triple word score and Scrabble kind of experience, right? It was just, I mean, the coal mines, I thought I had a stupid idea of coal mines. I thought coal mines were just like holes in the ground. I didn't realize that they were tall. They're like hundreds of feet tall, and it looks like a cyberpunk movie from another planet, you know. And in fact, I recommended when they asked me what I said, you should do a techno music festival there, you know. So, and at the same time, Essen is famous for the regenerative powers, right? That it's done a lot of planting. So, yeah, the energy and the oddness and the perversity of our species, especially this year in America, it never ceases to amaze me. But there are heroic moments. As I often say to students, this is a rotten moment. I'm sorry, I apologize, and you're going to have to do a lot of stuff. But this sounds strange, but as an old man talking to you, it will be the making of you. And so that's all I can say. So going over what's changing now. The ports are very, very strange right now because of other things that are happening. But I mean, Berlin is ridiculous. It's like an epic erasure, right? Layers. So the Europeans are very comfortable with layers, I think. I have so many stories. But anyway, let's move for other questions because all these questions bring us to things. And yes.
So I'm working on city right now. That's feeling about.
Well, maybe you should tell people who you are. Yes.
I'm working on a commission city right now, restoration, warehouse, port.
Oh, whoa, yes. And this is a fellow who's lived in Pedro for a very long time. And he's a photographer who's been battling the elements for a long time.
That's right. But we'd love you to come down and do a tour there.
Oh, yes, let's arrange it. Let's figure out a way.
They built fake Quonset huts up there. You wouldn't have a party.
Yeah. So let's and let's get a whole do an artist charrette, not an architect charrette, and peel the layers away and get the cameras working and make a film out of it. He does look happy though. Other. Oh, here's someone else who has a question. I hope is it getting too late for you? Are you okay?
No, it's fine.
Because remember, it's 9 hours difference.
See if we can dig some that. Anything fascinating about the LA Times or the building?
I mean, what the LA Times has turned into? Isn't
Yeah.
it a Von's penny saver now? I thought I always keep looking. Yeah. The LA Times has been destroyed as a newspaper. It's
No, pitching that's conspiracies or anything that.
the LA
Times.
all right, well, the LA Times is owned by one family, as you probably know, right? And that family was the Chandlers, though it was really two families in a way. And then they sold to the Chicago Times. The family left. Chicago Times was then taken over by a swindler who went to prison and kleptographically sucked money out of the LA Times and destroyed the paper. So I would say you could get a good Netflix series out of what happened to this newspaper. And now the owner of the paper seems to be trying to be friendly with Trump. I'm afraid that the history of the news industry is an anti-tour of a more dismal sort. I hope they're doing better in Europe. I think they're doing slightly better in Europe. In America, it's almost like, I always say as a kind of joke, but it's not a joke, that we became tourists in our own city, right? Just the flaneur consumerism. Then we became tourists in our own body, right? And then as we became tourists in our own body, we then were colonized as if we were a colony and became essentially this empty shell. And now we have a presidency that's almost like a feudal kleptocrat. It's almost taking over, and we'll have to see, but it'll be quite a drama. And I still feel that in the end, people will find our drama very funny. I just have an idea that people will have trouble writing novels about it because it's so over the top, they'll have to tone down the characters. And I have this other image that in the future, children will dress up as Americans for Halloween. It'll become a kind of on. So I think the issue of this whole tradition, right, going back to the 18th century and their wonderful Diderot in particular, their wonderful sort of layering of what was wrong with the monarchy and so forth and what was not possible. They didn't believe there was a future, really. That came later. But I think we're heading into something. I see why you're looking at the 18th century again, because we're on the edge of worlds coming. And it's going to be, what the hell? It's our planet. We're entitled to it, not them.
We might have to do a costume party of few South Africans.
South Africans?
Yeah, I mean,
You mean like Musk?
and Peter Thiel.
Thiel. Oh, wow.
Oh my
So
God.
two,
You gotta like
well,
that guy, right?
Anyway, I mean, it's usually the Americans smirking at the Europeans, right? I'm afraid there's a reversal right now, and we'll have to see what it's like. But and then where the academic world is going to go, right? You fortunately are under the embrace of the German government, right?
Well, we have elections coming up in February, so we'll see where that leads.
Yeah. What's going to happen? Yeah, I mean, and then so the biggest anti-tour might be, why would someone voluntarily vote away their own freedom? Why would you do that, right? And in other words, you get everything clear, and then you can't figure out the other part of it. And that was Benjamin's curse also, as he drifted through Paris in the 1930s, right? Trying to imagine how far it would go. I often wonder whether are there biographies of Benjamin trying to accommodate to what he knew was coming, and how it all worked. We're in a, so not only are the cities changing every minute, right? But the culture of daily life is changing, and we're in charge of trying to make sense of it, and we're used to not being listened to, but we persist. Right? Are there other questions? Oh, there's someone back there. Is that okay, Jens? Do you have?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Oh, I hope this is interesting to you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I'm wondering about the use of these projections as a speculative technology, as like the potential for thinking about what does come next, about what the sort of future pressures are, about what the dreams of people in Los Angeles might be or might have been, alternatives.
Yes. Well, Jens and I have talked about this from time to time in those bleary evenings. One of us would be exhausted. This would be 9 hours. So do you think that this process has something to tell us about the present?
I think so. I mean, Benjamin has this phrase that superposition is also about what he calls remembering the new, which I think is a great formulation. So there is this idea of this also being future looking, in the sense of anticipating what is to come, not just looking at the past, but you sort of, as you saw with the image of City Hall, the 1930s to 1970s, and then the building that hadn't even been built is sort of overlaid at least in our image. So this idea of pointing forward, if you're looking at several layers of what has been erased, you're sort of implicitly also is looking at what maybe they're next. So this, I think, does have a sort of an anticipation function in a sense. Norman, I don't know if you would.
No, I would.
You agree.
I mean, in 2007, well, first of all, in 2004 and 5, Margaret and I began a project, Imaginary 20th Century, trying to layer the 20th century in a fictional way using 2,000 plus images. And so we decided that the coming of the 20th century was also layered in that way, that you saw what you saw and you didn't see it and so on. And then I took on a contract in 2007 to deal with the dismantling of the American psyche. And it's now called The Archaeologies of the Present. It'll be finished soon. So it almost is like using the superimpositional method to figure out what's wrong with us. The only problem is every 6 months, my angle changed. I've now rewritten the first 3 pages. I have records 46 times. And I've just finished the last rewriting, and I just can't stand it. I just have to get the book out. But yes, I did notice that you can use it to project things in the future. But I have trouble believing what I saw. I kept predicting things and getting them right, and then not believing myself. I predicted the crash of 2008 for years, but I never believed it. And then people called me on it. So while we were drifting to meet again, yes, I was going through my own, let's say, Benjaminian cycle, watching. I mean, when I first saw Trump going down the escalator, it was like a triple score in Scrabble. It was like horrible. He matched everything in my notes, so I knew what was going to happen. So I pretty much have a feeling of what's going to happen in the next 40 years. I don't, my clock doesn't work though. I don't know the exact day, but yes, I can see. And Pedro is in the middle of it. There's no doubt about it, because the remaking of the ports is going to be crucial. It's happening now. See, I knew it was happening now. What, do you think Benjamin knew that too? Did he know? He must have known. He must have, with his skills, right? What was it like when he saw Paris fall? Well, we know he was just terrified, and he carried his pills with him. Is that right? Well, I'll try to do. I want to leave the pill part out of it.
Yes, let's.
But other questions or anything? Just jump in with. There's a very casual pinball way that the art world has of talking through matters. So I hope you understand. Other questions? I'm seeing just people staring. They don't look unhappy, but they're here. But there's no other questions.
Well, I'll just say thank you then. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your interest. And thanks, Norman, for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.